When I examined the consciousness developed in those named black people in the 1800s, one of the most striking and disturbing aspects of this consciousness was their attachment to whites. Now, let's be honest. Many people who come from this lineage today still have a secret passion to be accepted by whites. But nowhere did this yearning manifest itself more than during the time of slavery, where some slaves were said to deny themselves freedom just to remain in the bosom of whites. Frederick Olmsted reports on this mentality during his travel through Virginia in 1852. And that's in his book titled A Journey in the Seaboard Slave States. And we're going to be reading from that right now, the PDF version. So we're going to turn to page 129, where Olmsted writes this: "The free black does not, in general, feel himself superior to the slave, and the slaves of the wealthy and aristocratic families consider themselves in a much better and more honorable position than the free blacks." Olmsted says that the free blacks didn't see themselves as better than the slaves. But the slaves who were owned by wealthy people, they thought of themselves as being better than the free blacks. And listen closely, because he's going to explain why. Their view of the matter is said to be expressed thus:
"Dirty free niggas got nobody to take care of them."
That's why they saw themselves as being better than the free blacks. In Commentary 242, we talked a bit about the childlike mind of the Negro, which developed from being provided for from a child all the way up into old age by the master. And what this gentleman here just said was the product of that consciousness, where it believes itself to be better owned by another human than to be free, no matter what the circumstance was. Now, how many Negroes thought like this? I don't know, right? I don't know. But I would not be surprised if it were a substantial number of people who carried this pattern of thinking, especially if they had owners who treated them well and pampered them to the point where the skill of independence was unnecessary to develop, right? Now let's keep reading. "It is for this reason that slaves of gentlemen of high character, who are treated with judicious indulgence, and who can rely with confidence on the permanence of their position, knowing that they will be kindly cared for as they grow old, and feeling their own incapacity to take care of themselves, do often voluntarily remain in slavery when freedom is offered them, whether it be at the South or North or in Africa." So security and certainty were contributing factors in their decision to remain slaves. And people often cling to certainty because the unknown is often way too scary for many people to explore, even during the time of slavery, right? Freedom was that unknown for many people, and they were ill prepared, and they lacked the confidence to face the other side of the coin. They already knew what slavery looked like, and being taken care of until old age probably didn't seem like such a bad idea to many of them, which is why Olmsted said that when they were offered freedom, they often voluntarily chose to remain slaves, right? Let's continue. "A great many slaves that have been freed and sent to the North, after remaining there for a time, are said to have returned, longing, like the faithless Israelites, for the flesh pots of slavery, of their own accord, to Virginia." Remember the biblical story of the Israelites leaving Egypt? And while struggling in the wilderness, they reminisced on how well fed they were in Egypt. Olmsted says that this is similar for many of the blacks who were freed and then sent to the North. After struggling for some time to make it on their own, they returned to Virginia, right? They didn't realize how hefty a price there was to be paid to be a free person, right? Here we go. "And their report of the manner in which Negroes are treated there, the difficulty of earning enough to provide themselves with the luxuries to which they have been accustomed, the unkindness of the white people to them, and the want of that thoughtless liberality in payments to them which they expect here from their superiors, has not been such as to lead others to pine for the life of an outcast at the North. A number of Mr. Aindolph's slaves, it has been several times mentioned to me, have thus returned." Uh-oh. It is well known that Mr. Aindolph took a humane and democratic view of slavery, and his neglect to educate them for the liberty which, after his death, he bequeathed to them, may have added much to that terrible remorse which darkened his deathbed. He didn't prepare them for the free world. He just freed them after he died, and the culture and customs they developed in the slave world were unfitting for the free world. The free world requires a completely different consciousness, character, and culture to thrive, which the master failed to assist them with developing. And you'll find this true with most of the blacks after the Emancipation Proclamation in the 1860s, which is about a decade after the time period we're discussing right now. They were freed without the proper psychological preparation for the new environment that they entered. And this had devastating effects for the later generations, right? Let's get some more.
It is certainly true that the Negroes, either slave or free, are not generally disposed to go to Liberia.
And for what reason? They weren't from Liberia, so why would they be disposed to go there? Many Negroes had over 200 years of lineage in America at this point. And that's one of the reasons that they wanted to stay, right? There's another one which we're going to talk about, but this here is one of them. Now pay attention.
It is a distant country of which they can have but very little reliable information, and they do not like the idea any more than other people of immigrating from their native country.
You see that? Olmsted knew that America was their native country. It wasn't a country in Africa like it was for many of their ancestors, right? Which are two separate things. Everyone's lineage goes back to Africa if you dig back far enough. So the question is, when did people start acquiring new identities? The answer is after they left Africa and they developed a distinct cultural identity for themselves. This is what happened to everyone on the planet who lives outside of Africa, including those they named the Negro in America, right? So like Olmsted said, they didn't like the idea of moving away from their native country, which is why the vast majority of them did not go to Liberia. But pay attention closely to what he's about to say next, right? Here we go.
But I really think that the best reason for their not being more anxious to go there is that they are sincerely attached in a certain way to the white race.
Did you hear that? From his observations and speaking with many slaves and visiting many plantations, Olmsted believed that the real reason, the reason behind the reason for blacks not wanting to go to Liberia is that they just wanted to be around white people, right? That's what they wanted to do. And the reason why I believe this is because I still see this mentality in some of the descendants of these people today, right? And I can tell that some have a hidden urge to be accepted by those that call themselves whites. Now, today, many will not dare to admit it, but their actions, their appearance, and their mannerisms are clear expressions of this hidden urge, right? And it's not that there's anything against white people, but it's just that nobody should live their lives longing for the acceptance of other people, right? That's no matter who they are. So that has to be worked on and completely purged from the consciousness. Let's keep going.
At all events, they do not incline to live in communities entirely separate from the whites, and do not long for entire independence from them. They have been so long accustomed to trusting the government of all weighty matters to the whites that they would not feel at ease where they did not have them to take care of them. They do not feel inclined to take great responsibilities on themselves and have no confidence in the talent of their race for self-government.
This is the Negro consciousness, accustomed to white authority, wanting to live next to the whites for the sake of comfort, and having the least desire to stand up on one's own 2 feet as independent people. And again, this is a mentality in the making for over 200 years at this point in 1852, right? No people on the planet are naturally this way, right? This childlike mind was the product of the slave environment, which took away the essential knowledge of being self-sufficient. This is what Olmsted is reporting. Now listen to this here.
A gentleman told me that he owned a very intelligent Negro who had acquired some property, and that he had more than once offered him his freedom, but he would always reply that he did not feel able to fall entirely upon his own resources, and preferred to have a master. He once offered him his freedom to go to Liberia, and urged him to go there. His reply was to the effect that he would have no objections if the government was in the hands of white folks, but that he had no confidence in the ability of black people to undertake the control of public affairs.
So he would have had no problem whatsoever going to Liberia if the whites were in control of it. But since it was ran by other black people like himself from America, he said, no way, Jose, am I going over there, right? Which ties back into Olmsted's reason on why blacks really didn't want to go to Liberia, and that's because there was no white Americans in proximity, right? Let's keep going.
I do not wish to be understood as intimating that the slaves generally would not like to be freed and sent to the North, or that they are ever really contented or satisfied with slavery, only that having been deprived of the use of their limbs from infancy, as it were, they may not wish now suddenly to be set upon their feet and left to shift for themselves. They may prefer to secure at least plain food and clothing, and comfortable lodging at their owner's expense, while they will return as little for it as they can, and have only the luxuries of life to work for on their own account. It is not easy to deprive them of the means of securing a share of these. These luxuries, to be sure, may be of very degrading character, and such as, according to our ideas, they would be better without, but their tastes and habits are formed to enjoy them, and they are not likely to be content without.
Those luxuries were things like alcohol, gambling, and fine clothing, which he mentions in his writings, and he suggests that these degraded their character, but their taste was molded in slavery to enjoy these habits, and they were not happy without them.
But to live either on their own means or the charitable assistance of others at the North, they must dispense with many of these things.
They must get rid of the slave Negro consciousness. That's what Olmsted is talking about, because that consciousness was going to work against them in the North. They couldn't bring that consciousness with them because it was an impediment to progress, right? In other words, they had to pivot, which is one of the words that P in Earpoist represents. It's a change in direction when a habit, idea, or anything is no longer useful to bring a person to a particular goal, right? And this is essentially the advice that Olmsted is providing to the blacks that want to succeed in the North. They have to pivot, right? Pay attention.
It is as much as most of them, more than some of them with us, can do by their labor to obtain the means of subsistence, such as they have been used to being provided with without a thought of their own at the South.
Meaning most of them in the North have to work a lot to obtain the basic essentials of living that were automatically provided to them by their master in the South.
And if they are known to indulge in practices that are habitual with the race, they will not only lose the charity but even the custom of most of their philanthropic friends, and then they must turn to pilfering again, or meet that most pitiful of all extremities, poverty from want of work.
If they go to the North and they do things aligned with the stereotypes about those who were named the blacks, such as laziness, drinking, gambling, dishonesty, and so forth, then they risk not being helped and losing job opportunities, right? And as a result, they would return to stealing or end up in poverty.
Again, suppose them to wish to indulge in their old habits of sensual pleasure. They can only do so by forsaking the better class of even their own color, or by chawing them down to their own level.
If they want to indulge in the old habits, then they will have to do one of two things. They will have to distance themselves from the more respectable people of the brown color, or they will end up pulling those people down into the pit with them. Here we go.
In this way, slavery, even now, day by day, is greatly responsible for the degraded and immoral condition of the free blacks of our cities, and especially of Philadelphia. It is perhaps necessary that I should explain that licentiousness and almost indiscriminate sexual connection among the young is very general and is necessity of the system of slavery.
Lots of sexual partners, and being promiscuous was a large part of the slavery program. This was not some new issue that popped up in the 1970s and 80s like some people try to narrate as the story. Many people from this lineage have been behaving like this for some time, right? And like Olmsted said, it was a necessity of slavery. And why is that, right? We have to remember that these people were being bred like animals. So chastity was never a virtue that was valued by most of the black slaves, right? It wasn't something that was important in that culture and community. Here we go.
A northern family that employs slave domestics and insists upon a life of physical chastity in its female servants is always greatly detested, and they frequently come to their owners and beg to be taken away, or not hired again, though acknowledging themselves to be kindly treated in all other respects. A slave owner told me this of his own girls hired to northern people. That the character and condition of some is improved by coming to the North, it is impossible to deny, From a miserable, half-barbarous, half-brutal state, they have been brought in contact with the highest civilization. From slaves they have sometimes come to be men of intelligence, cultivation, and refinement. There are no white men in the United States that display every attribute of a strong and good soul better than some of the freed slaves.
You hear what Olmsted said? There are no white men with better morals and character than some of the freed slaves. That's a huge statement for anyone to make at that time, right? And Olmsted himself was quite a respectable person outside of him having his eyes at times on the women, right? But other than that, he was one of the whites of higher character. So for him to say this means that there were some upstanding people who had built themselves up to a high degree of character, regardless of the skin color, right? And one of those people is this person here.
What would Frederick Douglass have been had he failed to escape from that service which Bishop Meade dares to say is the service of God? Had his spirit been once broken by that man who, Bishop Meade would have taught him, was God's chosen overseer of his body? What has he become since he dared commit the sacrilege of coming out of bondage? All the statesmanship and kind mastership of the South has done less, in 50 years, to elevate and dignify the African race than he in 10.
The great man Frederick Douglass, a person who pulled himself out of the pits of slavery and became an adept speaker and freedom fighter. He demonstrated courage and determination to the highest degree. And despite his predicament, he was able to overcome, and he became one of the strong and good souls that Olmsted mentioned, right? We're going to speak a little bit more about this figure in the next commentary. But for right now, hopefully you have enjoyed this commentary and you've learned a thing or two as we continue to climb the consciousness out of the pit in the 21st century, right? So right now, what I want to do is I want to thank you for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.